We are going to continue with our next speaker now. We'll keep the food will continue coming. We'll have keep eating, and then we'll have dessert next through the next speaker. So now we'll be able to hear from a medical expert on cannabis and information about medical interests and effects in cannabis. And this will be from Dr. Harkiran Gill. So Harkiran graduated from UCLA in 2010 with a bachelor's of science in anthropology. She went on to Columbia University, where she went to graduate school and got a master's in public health in socio-medical sciences with an emphasis in social science research. She was in charge of the Face AIDS organization, helping to prevent the spread of HIV. She just finished medical school at Western University in Pomona and will be completing a residency in the future. She hopes to go into family medicine to utilize her public health training to help develop treatment plans that address social determinants of disease, and will continue doing research in disease prevention. Okay, let's give a warm welcome for Harkiran Gill.
Hope you guys have enjoyed your lunch so far, and that dessert makes this presentation sweeter. So I'm going to talk about the use of cannabis among mobile medical delivery service clients. So I'll be talking about some research, and as a disclosure, we are using study material from GRASP, and that's been funded by GRASP. So we're all here because of the policy implications of marijuana legalization, and that in and of itself is an important reason why we should be doing more research. But another reason why we should be doing more research in medical cannabis is because of the opioid epidemic. Opioids are now the most prescribed class of medication in the U.S. Opioids include fentanyl, oxycodone, hydrocodone, codeine, morphine, and many others, and they're primarily used to treat chronic pain. The problem that we've been having with opioids is that they're highly addictive for patients. So once patients begin taking opioids, they have a hard time coming off of it. Currently, there are about 2.5 million people in the U.S. who have been diagnosed with opioid use disorder, and opioid use disorder includes having a strong desire to use opioids, having increased tolerance to opioids, and withdrawal symptoms when opioid use is stopped. Beyond just having an opioid use disorder, it's led to a lot of overdoses and deaths. There's an estimated 90 Americans that die every day from opioid use-related disorders and overdosing. So the rise of the opioid use disorder has led the CDC to create new guidelines, and the guidelines focus on decreasing dosage, providing recommendations for safer use for all patients, not just high-risk patients, and having more specific recommendations for monitoring and discontinuing opioid use. One of the problems of that is that tighter regulation of opioids could lead patients to using and switching to heroin, which could then lead to the same problem of people dying from drug overdoses. And here we have a figure of drug overdose deaths in 2014, with opioids being the leading drug, but the next one is heroin. So we don't want patients to go from opioids to heroin. So what do we do in this case? That's a question that has been asked among so many people, considering how big of a crisis this is. And cannabis has actually been proposed as an alternative treatment for chronic pain that has the potential of curbing the opioid epidemic. So how is medical cannabis used? So cannabis flowers secrete chemical compounds known as cannabinoids. And there's different types of cannabinoids, THC and CBD, for example. And basically, they mimic compounds that our bodies naturally produce called endocannabinoids. And endocannabinoids are activated to maintain internal stability and health. And so in this figure, there's in this inner circle, we have just the overall broad categories of what cannabis is used for. So pain and sleep disorders, gastrointestinal issues, behavioral, neurological, and other. And then over here are the different varieties of cannabinoids. And then on the outside are the specific disorders. And you can just see the range of things it's used for, from cancer and HIV to epilepsy to anxiety. It's used for so many different medical reasons. So cannabis versus opioids. The mechanism of action can kind of shed light to why it's been proposed as an alternative treatment for chronic pain. So they both have pain-relieving effects by binding to receptors on neurons, and that leads to setting off a sequence of events in the cell, and it results in the modification of the pain signals. So when cannabis is used in combination with opioid pain medications, it can lower the side effects, cravings, and withdrawal severity of opioids, and this is due to the fact that they have parallel mechanisms of action. As you can see here on the GABA neuron, you have the opioids receptor and the cannabinoids. So that's kind of the science behind it. So here's a comparison of the side effects for opioids and cannabis. Opioids have a lot of side effects, as you can see: sedation, dizziness, vomiting, constipation, physical dependence. Patients develop a tolerance to opioids where it's not even they're not even being provided with symptomatic relief. It can lead to respiratory depression, which is a dangerous side effect, and psychological addiction. And there are so many less common side effects also. Whereas cannabis, it hasn't been as closely studied, so there might be more side effects that we'll learn about in the future. But so far, acute psychomotor impairments, it can be harmful during pregnancy. There's long-term potential for neurophysiological decline and impaired intellectual functioning. And there's also been reported of withdrawal syndromes, but the severity of withdrawal is minor compared to the withdrawal syndrome that patients who use opioids experience. So a study was conducted on cannabis as an alternative to prescription drugs in 2017, where they asked 2,774 medical cannabis users what they use it for, and it was being used to navigate dose reductions and as an alternative to opioids. And the most common classes of drugs it was substituted for was opioids, and then also benzodiazepines and antidepressants. So it's not that it's just being substituted for opioids; it's being substituted for a lot of different prescription drugs. So with all of this information about how it works and the fact that patients are using it as a substitution, why is it that it's not used more widely, or why is there a stigma about it? So in order to understand that, we have to kind of understand the history of cannabis. So during the 1800s and early 1900s, physicians and pharmacists dispensed cannabis for various medical purposes. But then in 1937, the Federal Marijuana Tax Act was passed, and although it didn't prohibit the medical distribution, it made physician reporting requirements so burdensome that it effectively discouraged the practice of prescribing marijuana. And then in 1970, we had the Federal Controlled Substance Act, and that is when they defined cannabis as a Schedule I substance. And a Schedule I substance means that there's no accepted medical use and a high risk of addiction. So this law made medical and recreational cannabis use illegal. So there's been a lot of controversy over classifying it as a Schedule I drug. To be classified as a Schedule I drug, you have to have a high potential for abuse, you have to have no medical efficacy whatsoever, and the substance has to be so dangerous that it can't be tested even under strict medical supervision. So then if those are the classification requirements, does cannabis really fit under that? Does it have no medical efficacy whatsoever? And, the argument is that it does have medical efficacy, so it should not be a Schedule I drug. And, one of the biggest arguments against its classification is the fact that the U.S. government has a patent on cannabinoids as antioxidants and neuroprotectants, which kind of shows that, there is at least belief in writing that cannabinoids show benefits for treating stroke, heart attacks, inflammation, and autoimmune disorders, which means that its classification as a Schedule I drug might not be accurate, since in this patent it talks about its medical efficacy for different chronic conditions. And so there's been a lot of pushback over it being a Schedule I drug, and a lot of as we've seen, it's led to the legalization of medical cannabis in different states. But it's also something that's gaining steam in recent years. This was an article that was just published this week in Rolling Stone about a 12-year-old girl who has pediatric epilepsy, and she has seizures, and she experiences auras and collapses, due to her epilepsy. And medical cannabis is one of the reasons that she's able to go to school and function like a normal child, because it helps with her symptoms. And so the story in Rolling Stone was that this girl can't even go to Washington, D.C. to advocate for medical cannabis, because crossing state lines is something that she can't do and still use medical cannabis, because it's illegal in some of the states that she would have to cross, and she wouldn't be able to use medical cannabis when she's actually in the congressional building, since it's banned. And so with stories like this, it's continuing to gain steam for it being used medically. And so evidence of that is also in the recent legislation, and we now have 29 states and the District of Columbia that have legalized it for medical use. And there was a study in JAMA where the states with medical marijuana laws had a 24.8% lower mean annual opiate overdose death rate compared with states without such laws. And studies like this are, pushing for further research, and also for medical marijuana to be considered for one of the ways where we could curb the opiate epidemic. And another thing that has been noticed in states with legalized medical marijuana is that fewer pills are being prescribed. So that's another argument for why this trend should continue. The public has pushed for the trend of medical marijuana, but there's also been a push for recreational cannabis legalization, and it's been successful. In 2012, we had Colorado and Washington, and of course we all know, and that's part of why we're gathered here, we have it now legalized in California with the passing of Prop 64, which is set to allow for the sale of recreational cannabis on January 1st. So taking all of this information together, we can see that there's a push from the public to learn more about medical cannabis and to continue to promote its use. There's a push from the fact that it's been legalized for recreational use, and there's also the opioid epidemic, and these three reasons taken together is more than enough reason for us in public health to continue doing research. So our study takes place here in California with a population of patients from San Diego County. And our study aims are to examine cannabis usage patterns among customers of a mobile dispensary, including how they classify their use of cannabis, their reasoning behind using it medically, their reasoning behind using it as a substitute for prescription drugs, and their attitudes towards traditional medical therapies. And the goal is to inform future research on the potential public health implications of the legalization of recreational cannabis. And we want to use this research to determine knowledge gaps among the current population so that we can start to take steps to ensure its safe use. We're not aiming to recommend cannabis use in the place of opioids, but we believe it is worth investigating this issue due to the changing laws and due to the increase in patients self-medicating with it. So I'm going to go over the methods that we used and then the results, then get into a discussion of what we found in our study. So we took a sample of 21 people who used medical cannabis delivery service that we heard from earlier, GRASP. The eligibility criteria was patients that are over the age of 21, patients who have used the delivery service over 3 times, and who have spent over $100 on each cannabis order. So the way that we conducted the study was through semi-structured interviews. The benefit of doing semi-structured interviews is that we asked open-ended questions, and these open-ended questions allowed the participants to give us as much information as they wanted to, and allowed us to kind of elicit a greater understanding of their reasoning, and that's in line with our aims of understanding, what it's being used for, and what possible gaps there are. So the questions that we had included: what is your background with cannabis? What are the reasons you use cannabis? What motivated you to get medical recommendation and start using cannabis? Do you use it for medical use? Do you use it for recreational use? If for medical use, have you tried other types of medicines before you tried cannabis? What was your experience like? What kinds of things do you use for your medical ailments? Have you tried any natural things or other holistic therapies? And then once those questions were asked, we collected our data and we coded it. And some of the codes that we developed included medical cannabis use, mixed use, recreational cannabis use. And the purpose of codes was to create categories so that we can then start to discover the themes that were in across all of the interviews, and start to see what the greater implications are. So the results of our study, we had out of the 21 participants, 19 of them classified themselves as using cannabis for medical use, so that's 90.5%. Out of the 19 participant responses that we coded as medical cannabis use, 10 were coded for chronic pain, 4 were for mental health issues, 2 were for insomnia, and then 3 were for other medical reasons. And those medical reasons included ringing in the ears, using it for muscle relaxation for cerebral palsy, and using it for Crohn's disease related digestive issues. And then of the 19 participants who said that they were using cannabis for medical reasons, 13 of them also said that they use cannabis recreationally. So, for example, we had a participant who said, "I'm an artist and I make jewelry, and cannabis enhances everything in my world." And so what we'll talk about later is just how these categories don't neatly define, and what can be learned from this. And so 2 of the 21 patients said that they use cannabis primarily for recreational purposes. The strength of using a semi-structured interview was that we got to ask these open-ended questions, and we got to hear more from them. And although they said that they use it recreationally, they also said for pain relief, anxiety and for relaxation, and both of them said for insomnia. So we'll later discuss, whether this is for purely recreational use or whether these are things that maybe people don't recognize as being medical symptoms. And so once, we went over the data, the themes that seemed to emerge were distrust for the medical field, side effects of prescription drugs, clinical failure, addiction treatment, and cannabis as a prescription drug substitution. So we define distrust for the medical field as the patients expressing distrust towards traditional medicine, or them expressing distrust towards prescription drugs, or distrust towards doctors. And to read you some of the quotes, we had a participant say, my mother was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis when I was 10. I saw how overprescribed she was and lost respect with the level of treatment. The amount she was prescribed was horrendous. I don't like the way pharmaceuticals push their product on people. And from another participant, she said, doctors are just there to make profit with prescription drugs. Another theme that emerged was side effects of prescription drugs, and we define this as people who use cannabis to avoid the side effects, or they use cannabis because side effects were harmful to them, or that they use cannabis because they can tolerate it better than the prescription drugs that they were on. And so some of the quotes from this included, I've been a medical patient for 8 to 9 years due to an Allen wrench accident as I work in construction. That said, I've suffered nerve damage in my right hand and desire an organic approach to meds. I've tried Vicodin, ibuprofen, and Percocet. None of them were good for my system. Another quote, the VA tried to give me different prescription drugs. Xanax gave me an upset stomach. Percocet was awful. Another patient, I tried different pain medicines, including codeine and Advil. I love cannabis because there are no side effects to my kidneys. Another theme that emerged was clinical failure, and we define that as a lack of improvement of symptoms from the prescribed treatment plans. Also, if a participant expressed that their treatment plan was no longer working, or if cannabis was the only treatment that they claimed worked for them. And so some of the quotes that were included in this theme were, traditional medicine has failed me and my doctors don't know what to tell me. Another patient saying, I have PTSD and 2 back surgeries and I can't sleep. Cannabis is the only thing that works. I used to use Ambien. This is so much better. Another participant, the other medicines worked at first, but I built a tolerance to them and got addicted. Which brings us to our next theme, addiction treatment. We define this as participants who reported using cannabis to stop them from being addicted to their prescription drugs. And that included if they used it to help wean them off the prescription drugs, or if they used it to stop using the prescription drugs entirely. And some of the quotes, I got addicted to Ritalin, oxycodone, and Vicodin. I was able to get rid of everything with cannabis. Another participant, I had a lot of stress at work and got addicted to benzodiazepines, Adderall, antidepressants, and I was able to get off all of these meds with cannabis. Another theme was cannabis as a prescription drug substitution. So out of the 10 participants who reported using cannabis to treat chronic pain, 7 of them reported quitting the use of their prescription pain relievers. And that included Vicodin, Percocet, codeine, Advil, oxycodone, and morphine. And then out of the 2 participants who reported using cannabis to treat mental health issues, both reported their prior use of prescription psych meds, and that they quit their prescription drugs entirely and use cannabis regularly as a permanent substitution. One of the patients, a quote that really kind of shows the extent of using it as a substitution. She said, I was in a car accident about 30 years ago, and I broke almost every bone in my body. I was in the hospital for 6 months and was on morphine. The doctor in the hospital told me about cannabis, even though medical cannabis wasn't even around back then. I had to find some on my own, and so I met people who grew it, and it was very hush-hush. I love it because it helped me get off of morphine and Vicodin, which made me mean. I went through withdrawals, and cannabis helped me wean off and keep me off for the rest of my life. I am in pain every day, so I need it every day. So this participant, it kind of fit into a lot of our themes of using it as a substitution, of wanting to avoid side effects, of the stigma surrounding using it at first, and the fact that she now uses it as a permanent substitution. And so overall, our study is consistent with previous findings that chronic pain is the leading medical reason for using cannabis, and that patients are using cannabis as a substitute for opioids. We also found that there's overlap with how cannabis users classify themselves. So earlier in the results section, I talked about how 68% of the participants classified themselves as medical users. Also, in addition to, even though they classified themselves as medical users, said that they use it recreationally. And of all of the patients, all 2 of them, who classified themselves as recreational users, said that they also use it for reasons such as insomnia, anxiety, and pain relief, which are medical reasons. And so this finding shows that users do self-medicate, and sometimes they don't even realize that they're self-medicating. So what are the implications of self-medication? It means that there could be a decrease in checkups and primary care visits, because if patients are using cannabis, to treat whatever conditions they're going under, they're less motivated to go see their primary care doctor and get a diagnosis and treatment. And the other thing, one of the things that's most worrisome about this is that they're not being counseled on use when they're self-medicating themselves. And this could result in a dependency on cannabis. And it definitely highlights the fact that there's a need for more education of cannabis use to help people who are self-medicating. Based on our thematic analysis, something that we found to be significant was the fact that there's a distrust for the medical field, and this is something that healthcare providers have to take steps towards starting to continue to engender trust with patients. And the fact that there's a distrust for the medical field perpetuates the problem of self-medicating, because patients aren't able to, they're not motivated to then go back to their primary care doctors and to get advice on what to do. So some preventative measures could include more effort to partner with patients and develop plans that they're comfortable with. And this also could help them with the side effects that they're complaining of about their prescription drugs. What some of these themes have just together highlighted is that if there's better communication between doctors and patients, maybe there can be something that's done to make prescription drugs not be such a horrible experience for the patients, and to make sure that the side effects are minimal, or switch them on something else, or decrease the dosage so that they're able to tolerate it better. So the limitations of our study included the fact that it was a small sample size and it came from a delivery service, which may mean that the customers differ from other users of medical cannabis. And we also had selection bias due to the screening criteria. And so for future research, I think the fact that it's classified as a Schedule I drug has made it hard to study, but that means that it's more important than ever to study it, considering the laws that are now going to be put in place. And so we suggest studying long-term effects of cannabis use, to continue studying recreational users and their patterns of use, because this could reveal whether medical conditions are going undiagnosed, and whether or even just give us a sense of how many people are struggling with anxiety and pain and these things and depression, which are going undiagnosed. More research on mobile cannabis delivery service and how they differ from other users. This is a modality that is becoming more and more popular, so it's something that we definitely think should be looked into more. And then research on how much information about cannabis safety is being disseminated by dispensaries, and that's for the safety of future customers, and to kind of start to make sure that we're doing our best to make sure that patients are safe with their usage of cannabis. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Now I have the honor of embarrassing a friend and mentor who is here. today is his birthday. This is Meyer Leskin. He's 92 today, and he's a celebrity here on campus. He's a philanthropist, and this is the Leskin Conference Center where he donated the building where my wife graduated from for graduate school, and so we got you a cake as a happy birthday. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Meyer. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you all, and I am embarrassed.
I got you. You can take this back to your family. Got you this, and then they can wrap it up. And you can take it back.
Well, why don't we share it with everybody here? I'll tell you my wish, which is good health and a lot of love to all of you.
All right. All right. Thank you.
Why don't we have some for everybody over here? Maybe take half of it.
Okay, we do half for people on the box in half.
You have to.
There's some special ingredient in this cake. Go roll and race yourself,
Technically still illegal. It's technically still illegal.
Still in there somewhere.
Okay, just take the bag out. Use waves.
Any words of wisdom or life guidance?
Do a good job as you just did. I think what you did is a great presentation. And so, what's in your character to give a good presentation? Keep it up.
Here, here.
All right, everyone. So now I'm going to talk about some of the research that we do at our institute with technologies. I'll get into some of the work we've done with California Highway Patrol also. And a lot of the work that we do is focused on social data. And so we'll give another perspective on research that can be done also with the growing changes in cannabis laws around social data and other kinds of data. So just a funding disclosure or thanking our sponsors for providing funding for this research from the NIH, from University of California, our president, Janet Napolitano, as well as corporate funding. All right, who knows what this is? Moneyball, yes. Okay, Moneyball, the book and movie Moneyball. What's Moneyball about? Betting? Okay, betting, gambling.
Oh, yeah. Data-driven choices.
Data. Anyone else?
Prediction?
Winning. Okay. So whenever I give this presentation, there are lots of answers, and depending upon where the presentation is or who the audience is, people have different explanations for it. So I'll ask, what is this about? And if I give it to data people, they say data or statistics. If I give it to people who are sports fans, they'll say it's about sports. It's about how the Oakland A's became a winning team. Or if I give it to, especially in the Bay Area, that's what happens. I give it to the Bay Area, and they say it's about how the A's started winning. The A's started winning. But what this is about to me as as in here at UCLA is this is about how we can use technology data for predicting and addressing important events. So the story behind this was the Oakland A's manager, this was in a book and played by Brad Pitt, and Jonah Hill played a statistician. It was the idea of how we can take a baseball team that was not successful, the Oakland A's, and by getting statistics involved, by having a statistician, they could pick winning players and put together a winning team, and it worked. But this was over 15 years ago. And thank you. This was over 15 years ago that this took place, and so times have really changed. Tools have changed. Data has changed. We have access to more data and more information than we've ever had before. So if we think about social media, for example, every day there are 500 million tweets that are sent every day. 500 million tweets. Now, 400 million are actually sent by President Trump, but it still leaves 100 million that are out there from others. We have 55 million status updates on Facebook every day. That's just the big social networks. On the smaller ones, 700 million snaps every day, and 70 million perfectly filtered Instagram photos every day. Now, when social media first came out, there was a question of whether this was just a fad. Are people going to continue using this? Why are people posting anything about themselves? Who cares? But now today we realize if people aren't posting things on social media, if they're not telling us that they brushed their teeth this morning, then something must be wrong. So social data are here to stay. And one question in medicine and in public health is, are people just posting meaningless information? Are people making meaningless posts? Or can we actually use that information for ways to be able to predict and address real-world problems? And we believe that the information can actually address real-world problems. So here's an example. What are people tweeting about? Well, relevant to this, here's someone tweeting that they're drunk driving. People will talk about they're trying to have sex tonight. They'll talk about personal health issues like getting tested for STDs. They'll talk about the drugs that they are using. And they'll talk about personal issues such as related to HIV. So put this together, we believed that there was evidence that we could look through. This is all public information. People are publicly sharing this with the world. And it can be located. It carries a location tag with it where you can see where they're talking about these topics. So just to give a case study of how this might be relevant, back 2 years ago, a couple of years ago, some of you may have heard, there was a small place in rural Indiana that experienced an HIV outbreak. And this came out of nowhere. It was really shocking to people. It started with 5 people who were infected with HIV. It turned into 10, 20, 100. Soon, this small area with just 4,000 people, there were 200 cases of HIV there. And part of the reason for this spread of this epidemic was there was a lack of data available. So the current process of collecting data would be someone would go into a clinic, they may be presenting with symptoms or something to get them tested, they would test positive, it would get reported to the county, to the state, to the CDC, to the public. And there's a big lag time in being able to respond. So meanwhile, while this is going on, cases of HIV are being transmitted. In the case of HIV, and this holds for many other public health areas and areas of disease, there's a big lag time in reporting. So we're going to be finishing 2017 in a couple of months. we are not going to know how many cases of HIV occurred in 2017 for another 2 to 5 years, until 2019 to 2023 or so. That's when we'll know how many cases of HIV actually occurred. So it makes it really difficult to act on information and prevent the spread of HIV or other diseases or public health events when there's this lag time in reporting of data. And that's something mentioned by Chief Davis of, especially with data are changing quickly, science is changing quickly, but public health organizations and government agencies are just realizing the potential and need to create infrastructures to be able to analyze all this data and figure out what to do with it. So here's an example of something we did to address the HIV issue. We collected 500 million tweets on Twitter, so people publicly reporting information on Twitter that were geolocated. We were able to tag these as whether they were related to HIV or not. So were they talking about, they were about to engage in sexual risk-related behaviors or drug-related behaviors that were related to HIV. And then we could map these conversations on Twitter, and we could be able to see where are people having conversations that suggest they may be at risk for HIV. We then there were data available from AIDS View, which is the CDC's reporting of HIV cases. And so we could see the counties where we're having more HIV cases as well. And what we found was that the counties where we find more tweets of people talking about doing things that would put them at risk for HIV are the same counties where we're finding higher rates of HIV. So this led to, this was an early study just showing the feasibility that we can use social data from Twitter, from other data sources for being able to monitor and predict real-world events. And it led to the formation and funding by our president, Napolitano, to form the Institute for Prediction Technology. We're fortunate enough to have Vagelis here, who's our site director of UC Riverside and does much of the big data and computer science work. And together we are looking to address public health and different types of real-world problems rapidly through the use of social media data. One of the great things about the Institute and that the funding comes from a real-world, someone who really cares about real-world solutions like President Napolitano, who was head of Homeland Security, is that we work with government organizations like the California Highway Patrol, we work with corporations, we work with entrepreneurs to solve real-world problems. So let me give an example. Facebook has been interested in looking at online safety. If you look on the left, this is a pretty dramatic example. If you look on the left, here's a student who was tweeting about things that suggested he was having some mental health issues, some real problems. Well, a month later, he killed 3 of his classmates and killed himself. Now, this is the kind of thing where this is not currently being done, but we have the ability and have the need to be able to monitor what's happening on social media, on different data sources, so that we can prevent things like that. This is preventable, we can prevent this, and we just need to set up the infrastructure and tools to do it. We did a study here at UCLA in partnership with Chancellor Block and with Intel, where we gave freshman students, wearable devices to track sleep and activity. We followed them on Twitter and gave them weekly surveys to assess their exercise habits, their sleeping habits, and learn about their health behaviors. And we found that we could, by looking at what they're talking about online, we could actually predict and monitor their weekly stress levels. We could predict their sleep habits. We could predict all kinds of different health behaviors just by looking at from them allowing us to follow them on Twitter. And so as a result, we created a dashboard. Here's an example. And this is a dashboard which now looks at social media data and can be able to, across different universities, provide in real time information of how stressed out students are, how happy they are, and other areas of health. We're currently, one of the things we're doing is looking at cyberbullying, which is a big risk for mental health issues, and happening on college campuses, and so that's another thing we're working on. Just a few other things types of work that we're doing. We have partnerships with the CDC where we are working on creating HIV and STD maps that use social data to predict changes in trends. And I'll talk about in a minute working with California Highway Patrol, Twitter, different apps where we create maps that can show what people are talking about online and create actual prediction models of where we might expect changes in public health events. Okay, I'll shift now and tell you about some of the work we've done with the California Highway Patrol. So one of the challenges that we learned about and discovered is how do we address car accidents and decrease the time for first responders to get on the scene. So correct me, Chief Davis, on this, but so when someone gets in a car accident, they'll call a 911 operator. It gets routed to either 911, paramedics, CHP. There's a dispatch where CHP or a paramedic is then called and comes to the scene of where the accident occurred. Well, through this process, just like the HIV examples and other examples, there's a delay in getting people to help those who are victims of car accidents. And if we could decrease the time for first responders to get to the scene of a car accident just by 40 seconds, you can save tens of thousands of lives around the country. So that's what we wanted to do. And the question was, can we just change the process of how data are collected and change that process? Can we use Waze? We had a partnership with Google and Waze. And so could we be able to, so what Waze is, Waze, for any of you who don't know, Waze is a crowdsourced app where people typically use it for, especially in LA, cutting down traffic times to get from one place to another. But Waze drivers can report objects on the road, they can report car accidents, they can report things in real time. So the idea was, rather than waiting for someone who's a victim of a car accident or someone who sees it to call 911, can we look at Waze reported data as a way of getting information about real-time accidents? So we collected data from both California Highway Patrol on car accidents as well as from Waze on Waze alerts from their users. This was earlier this year. In May we did this study. And then we were able to create a map of looking at where these CHP events and Waze events occur. And what we figured out was that by looking at Waze data, we could actually detect a car accident with 93% accuracy. We could detect car accidents 43 seconds before first responders were alerted to it using Waze data. So that's the implications of that, are that we could potentially, tools like this could save tens of thousands of lives. And in working with in building partnerships like this with Chief Davis and the California Highway Patrol and with Google, we can work on developing tools like this to be able to save people's lives, really. Just to tell you a little bit about the study, we looked at Waze alerts and CHP data. Here's the amount of data we had. Here's an example of what the data looked like as reported from CHP. We had a feed of CHP reported events, including accidents, as well as Waze reported events. These are examples of, let's say, a traffic collision. Someone reports on Waze. And then we used a method, we used a number of machine learning methods and ultimately used a model called the random forest model, where we classified each event. We wanted to see, could we predict whether something was a car accident or not. And we found that with 93% accuracy, we could save, it was 43 seconds. Now it's not just enough to identify an event or predict an event or detect an event that's occurring. Another thing that we do is once we can predict an event like this, if we can predict a car accident, how do we actually change behavior? How do we get people to do things differently? So the other area that we work on is behavior change. And through a number of studies, we've used technologies to be able to incorporate the behavior change science in them to be able to get people to do things differently. In the case of HIV, we have a science behind how we can get people at risk for HIV to test for HIV. And this uses online communities and different technologies. Here's an example from one of our papers focused on HIV. But we've also applied these behavior change approaches to a broad number of other fields, and we've tried it and found similar results in other countries like Peru. So there's really a lot of success that we're finding, not only in predicting events, but in the technology and approaches to change behavior and get people to do things differently. Here's an example relevant. I'll finish with this. Here's an example relevant to drug use. We have funding from National Institute of Drug Abuse. And this was a behavior change intervention that we did using our online technology for the opioid epidemic. And can we be able, this was with UCLA patients who have chronic pain, who are on opioids and at risk for overdose, at risk for addiction. And we found that we could use these same technologies and behavior change science to be able to get them using online communities and reduce their risk for addiction and overdose. So with that, I will end here, and I will end here. All right, so at this point, perfect, we are right on time. So at this point, we'd like to welcome our panelists back here to come up. Let's take a break for 5 minutes. If you guys want to go to the bathroom or grab a drink, we'll have our panelists come back here. And if you could please send to Claire any questions that you've had, so moderated for our panel. Claire, what is your email is CL?
It was my first name, and then HOULI, and then @ucla.edu.
So if you can just email her any questions that you have, and we'll moderate the questions up here for the panel. And same for the live streaming, we'll check the live stream for everyone. What? You sent to her? Okay, great. Let me just find Claire. Oh, it's just class right now. Okay. Then,
So she said that she forwarded me anything that she got.
perfect. Perfect. Okay, great. All right, Veronica, we'll finish up. We'll get you back up there. Thanks. You got the link?
Yes, thank you.
David, can you send me the questions that you have? I didn't. Just forward them to me. Claire's off at class. All right, so now we are at the time where we are going to have a panel. We've invited our panel back up, and we have a question and answer session where I've been forwarded a number of questions from our group here as well as from our audience online, and so we'll have a moderated panel session for the rest of the time, and then we will have a wrap up to conclude the day. All right, so looks like we have a great assortment of questions. We'll start. Let's start in the area of technology. One of the questions is, what role do you anticipate technology will play starting in 2018 after legalization occurs, and what will that process be like? Will technologies instantly be different starting in 2018, or if not, how do you anticipate trends changing starting in January of 2018?
I'm sure we can all probably weigh in on this. Right. Speaking from law enforcement, as I alluded to, and as David alluded to in his presentation, I think a big element for us is going to be the use of roadside testing technology to better help us to better identify impaired drivers roadside, similar to what we have today for alcohol.
We built our second iteration of our technology to launch in Arizona and to comply with all those detailed regulations, and also so that it would allow for us to expand nationally and internationally and be malleable to different regulations. So it's a work in progress. We're continuing to learn and continue to work on our technology, so it won't be, I think technology is always in a process of improving.
I have been looking, and I will continue to look to the consumer space. Already, in the last year, there has been a tremendous increase in sales of home testing kits for marijuana use and cannabis use. So I think that as far as projections should be made, we should look to sales at pharmacies.
Okay. Another question. What are some of the ethical questions or privacy concerns that will take place now in starting to monitor cannabis use, both on the road and off the road? What are some things that both from the government and law enforcement perspective, as well as from the general population, consumer, patient perspective, what are some of the ethical concerns? And this is a big question, so feel free to elaborate on it a lot.
Well, privacy is certainly a hot topic today, and that's why we take extra steps to protect our patient data with HIPAA-compliant servers, the highest levels of medical encryption. But we get faced with this issue all the time, because in order for people to sign up for our service, they do need to submit their documentation, which we verify. In Arizona, it's a little bit different because everything is tracked and traced. So you do see everything going through the government. And so, there will be concerns from consumers, but overall, it's meant to create a safer and more protected environment. So While there will be concerns, there will also be improved efficiencies for data protection and privacy as well.
I would just add that where this will raise a large question from a practical standpoint, and I think this is also something maybe Veronica will also weigh in, is in terms of the marketing side, I would also look to how this affects transmission of PII by Google and Facebook in terms of delivery of advertising content and creation of advertising content. In terms of the development of apps. So Grasp is an app ultimately, or the interface at least is a smartphone app. And a lot of the innovation that will be created in this space, from my perspective, will be to try to eliminate the computing aspect. As I was saying to Chief Davis, I think that too much of the expense involved in trying to create sensing things, whether it is from tracking the seed all the way to the consumption, as was required in some states, or whether it be the detection of a THC level, too much of that is on the computing side. That can be handled by a smartphone, but then that means an app. If there's an app, it means an operating system like Google or Apple. And if that's the case, it means transportation of PII along that operating system. And then the question will be, what does Google or Apple mandate from a perspective of their operating system? They already have rules in place about what kind of PII they will permit in their operating system. And I think that no one knows how they will handle this kind of data from the perspective of what they want the FBI to look at. And I think that they've already had their own issues. So I think that's going to be a big question mark, the ethical part, and in terms of the operating systems that handle this data.
And I will say from a marketing perspective, Google, organizations like Google, Facebook, Instagram, they are constantly shutting down accounts for companies that are marketing towards cannabis users. So because of the Schedule I substance label for cannabis, a lot of marketing via these technologies and organizations, digital organizations, are not prohibited at this time, or not allowed at this time.
All right, so another question in each of your fields, what are the limitations right now? What are the needs in order to be able to solve problems in terms of how to have safer, more regulated delivery and safety on the road? So for example, in the medical field, what are the unmet medical needs? What kind of information or data is needed to help drive better clinical decisions? Same with in the technology field, in the mobile delivery, and in the law enforcement and regulation areas.
Well, in the medical field, due to marijuana being classified as a Schedule I drug, there's been a limited amount of studies on it, and so there's a need to do more clinical trials to get a better understanding of what the side effects are, what is an appropriate dose for patients, how much should they be using, and from those findings, doctors can give better guidelines for patient use. And there's a big need to educate patients, and that starts with doctors having the data and the knowledge to disseminate, and also for there to be a more open dialogue about it between doctor and patient.
From a technology perspective, I would say one of the key things that is missing is still operator acceptance. So operator acceptance would mean what would law enforcement on a grand scale accept in terms of a sensing technology. So certainly there are things that are available at different price points, but there is no wide-scale data about what a patrolman would accept in the middle of the night pulling someone over and testing them, nor is there data about what would be accepted from an evidentiary point of view. And so there are multiple people who would have to accept a technology on many, many, many different levels within the legal system, and there is no data on what would be acceptable the way that a blood alcohol content level breathalyzer exam would be accepted. So I think that operator acceptance thing, which is typically applied to every piece of technology before it's finally widely accepted that still has not been achieved for any marijuana sensing technology.
I would just say from a technology standpoint, better abilities to share data and to increase learnings across state lines. And then I would say for limitations and what our needs are, we just need sensible regulations. Regulations that balance the need for public safety with the needs for medical patients, and then also the needs of business owners where, you know, if you look at the rollout of both of programs in both medical states and recreational states, there are a lot of people who get into the industry that end up going out of business due to the regulations. So there's some area of opportunity there.
And I think from the law enforcement perspective, to go back to just research needs with regards to better understanding how cannabis, and for that matter other drugs, really affects one's ability to drive, to kind of get to the point where we are now with alcohol, where we have a good idea with presumptive levels of impairment and so forth, just to collect more data and to get more research done so we have a better understanding of that for cannabis.
Great. So just to dive a little bit deeper into that, so each of you talked about limitations and needs within your industries and within your areas. There's often and continues to be a discussion and need for collaboration between government and researchers and entrepreneurs, business, health professionals, all these different areas. So thinking about the needs, and some of you touched on this, what are the opportunities to be able to collaborate with others who are outside of your area? You know, for example, just across the different disciplines at the table, what are some opportunities for cross collaboration and how you can work together to solve problems?
I'm sorry, I think from the law enforcement perspective, I think I talked previously about some of the work, for example, that has been done at UC San Diego with kind of refining and identifying perhaps new ways of investigating impaired drivers roadside. We have standardized field sobriety tests, which are very effective. We take great pride in the effectiveness of those tests, but they've been the same tests for quite some time. So we're always looking to explore if there's always a better way. And that's, I think, if we're not looking to try to find that better way, I think we're doing a disservice to ourselves and the people of California. So that's one thing for law enforcement, is always looking for that next best way to help us identify and better apprehend impaired drivers.
And as far as technologies go, there are some interesting technologies coming out that track plant genealogy to ensure that the strains that are being sold are true genetic strains. And that's going to be important for true medical users who rely on the specific terpene profiles of different strains for their medical needs. And then I just have to comment on the work that Dr. Sean Young's doing with Waze and CHP. I just think it's genius, and I think that from what I understood, and please, Chief Davis, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought when Waze first came out and there was a lot of reporting of where police were located, there was a little bit of the Highway Patrol wasn't exactly happy about that technology, but then when you think about the efficiencies that can come from using it to help with traffic safety and that kind of thing, I think it's incredible.
Yeah, I can't speak to our position as far as when it first came out. I hadn't heard that. Okay. Not saying some didn't feel that way, but I think with whether it's Waze or any data application out there, I think we're always excited about opportunities to increase our efficiencies and ultimately even, you know, like you mentioned in your presentation, you know, getting officers to the scene quicker to help save lives, which at the end of the day is what we're most concerned with.
What I heard today that was very exciting was we heard some actual data from Dr. Gill about actual marijuana users. And we heard about their actual distrust of the medical establishment. And as I said in my presentation, I think in many ways humans are the best sensors. And that's why in medicine, you know, the gold standard is typically surveys of patients. And it's very, very hard to find a sensor that can never replicate that. So I'm grateful that we had your presentation, we had that actual gold standard data present today, because I don't think there would ever have been an appropriate substitute for that. And that data she was lucky that she was able to get it from your organization. So thank you very much for having that. I think what we need is more collaborations with companies like yours that enable us to work with actual cannabis users who are willing to share that kind of information, to let us know how they feel about their experiences behind the wheel and their experiences with law enforcement and their experiences with their physicians who are going to continue to be prescribing what's happening, so that we are able to cultivate peer leaders like your certified drivers who apparently are willing to subject themselves to extreme vetting to have the privilege of serving them. And I think that that is ultimately the goal here, is to set positive examples. That ultimately is going to be the challenge for CHP, is to to educate and to train, it sounds like. And I think that where Dr. Young has, he has inspired me to collaborate with him, and he's inspired me to want to be part of his work, is that he takes the data and he does more than just analyze it and make predictions about it. He takes it and then he tries to change actual behavior. And I think that that's part of what also has to be part of the discussion, is there's going to be a lot of new people on the road who young drivers who are going to be on the road, who will also be taking advantage of recreational cannabis at some point, some of who are also going to have to be given driver's ed and other things, and this will also have to be part of that matrix. So I think that there's going to have to be some positive role models and positive examples provided to them as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for collaboration. The part that I'm most excited about is taking all of this information and incorporate it into where CHP is going to go into 2020, is it 20 or 2022, I think, for the training aspect of the local governments and the local partners across the state. Because I hope a huge part of that goes into that driver's ed training and things that are going to actually touch new drivers, young drivers who are going to be new to the wheel and new to cannabis, perhaps at the same time.
Right.
Right. So that's really where you guys are possibly going to be experiencing the absolute greatest risk.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up education. I've talked a lot about data, we've talked a lot about technology, and I've talked a lot about our training and our enforcement, but education is a key component of this discussion. And like you alluded to, in order to promote and produce effective communication and effective educational messages, we probably need to learn a little bit more about the audience and the people whose mindset we're trying to change. So that's also a great opportunity for collaboration as well.
So with this new law and marijuana no longer being illegal and its usage being decriminalized, there's this golden window of opportunity to do more research now. And even if it's not clinical trials, we can start with cross-sectional surveys that ask users about side effects, that ask them how much they use a week, and because of this law, they can feel more comfortable being open. So that could start to inform some guidelines for how much use is appropriate, and from there it could build to hopefully one day having CDC guidelines on marijuana usage the way that they have it for so many other drugs, including opioids, and that could then inform law enforcement for some guidelines on what is safe use of it, and what is too much, and what is a threat to public safety versus being safe.
All right, so one final question, and this is something that a number of us I've heard in private conversations have had throughout the day, but a question that was raised. Autonomous vehicles, how is that going to change the future of this area, either within your focus area or just broadly? How are autonomous vehicles going to affect these changing laws and implications of it?
I think for law enforcement, it's going to have a profound impact on us, but I think it's further down the road. So I think there's going to be a lot of work to be done between now and the time that autonomous vehicles are the predominant vehicle on our roadways. But absolutely, it's something we don't want to lose sight of, because a day will come when potentially a vehicle can drive you and you could potentially be impaired in that vehicle legally. And so that's something we're cognizant of, and something that we're monitoring. The CHP, we've developed an internal autonomous vehicle working group, so it's definitely an issue we're looking at in partnership with the Department of Motor Vehicles and other stakeholders. So that's a big deal to us as well in our profession.
Thus far, all regulations have prohibited autonomous vehicles with the delivery of cannabis. Drones have also been prohibited as well. The future may change that, though, as technologies improve and data is released and studied. There's a future for that.
So I've always been a bit of a naysayer on dreading the future. That's my nature, and I look to the history of both autopilot in the case of aviation and cruise control in the history of automobiles as it pertains to alcohol consumption in both categories. And I'm not certain, because I don't have the data in front of me, that it will be particularly different in the case of cannabis. There will be people, perhaps, in the case of autonomous vehicles, or more autonomous vehicles, because current vehicles still have autonomous capabilities. Our current vehicles have cruise control. Our current vehicles have the ability to do some features autonomously. For example, they have automatic transmissions. It used to be that human beings had to manually shift gears. They currently don't have to do that. So there are features in our vehicles that are autonomous. There will become, I think the correct way to think about autonomous vehicles as more autonomous. Those more autonomous vehicles will still need to know the destination of that autonomous vehicle. That new quote-unquote autonomous vehicle will still need to be unlocked by someone. That new quote-unquote autonomous vehicle will still need to be purchased by someone. So those quote-unquote autonomous vehicles will still have human masters. And so therefore they will still have human owners, and those human owners will still be legally liable. And as long as those machines are legally liable, there will have to be a police. And as long as that machine is legally liable to someone, there is a police, someone will have to police it, and someone will have to take responsibility. And if there is responsibility, that responsibility can be impaired by a drug. So whether or not, and therefore that person is capable of doing something foolish. And I'm not concerned about the possibility of foolishness being eradicated because of autonomousness. Okay, that I don't think that that's going to happen. I therefore deny the possibility of foolishness going away.
From a medical perspective, I don't think it's going to change our scope too much, because even if patients are being safely transported, our scope is whether their health is okay. And even if they're safe and not causing accidents, our concern is side effects and if it's affecting any of their organs. So for us, it won't really change the scope of our focus, which will going forward be safety and side effects.
All right, let's give a big thank you for our panel. And I'll now make just a few minutes of just closing remarks of things that I've noted, and then you guys can be on your way. So today, I think today was excellent. I'm really pleased with the group that came together, the perspectives that were discussed, the thoughts and questions that came from the audience and viewers, and I think we learned a lot today, and we learned also a lot of what we don't know and what we need to explore in the future. So just breaking things down, we started hearing from Chief Davis about CHP perspective in driver safety and laws and regulations and funding opportunities in this area, as well as what are the needs from government and from the California Highway Patrol. We then heard from Veronica about how mobile delivery of cannabis is growing as an industry and how it can be used, and that there's a growing need for it among cannabis users. We heard a little bit more about that need. Harkiran Gill, she talked about from the medical side, why are patients using cannabis? And there are, a mix of reasons and areas, and some of them are difficult, for us as health and medical people, sometimes difficult to hear that there's, let's say, distrust of the system or medications aren't working, but it's important to hear about alternatives in what patients are using often to self-medicate, to learn about that and see the need for science in those areas to discover it. And then finally, we talked about social data and about different methods for indirect monitoring and the health and safety of what people are doing. You know, I think my biggest take home from all of this is that there are, you know, on the one side, there are a lot of challenges ahead of us. Chief Davis was talking about, just for one thing, budgetary challenges of there's funding that's assigned, but it's unknown when or how that funding will take place. At the same time, this law begins January 1st, and so how can government agencies, how can medical professionals, how can everyone respond when funding, when and how it's delivered is uncertain. So there are a number of challenges in each of your industries, in each of the areas that were discussed, but I think what I hear is that there are a lot of opportunities here, and that's something I think that's exciting for all of us, regardless of what area or industry we're in. For me as a researcher, it means researchers aren't going anywhere. There's a lot of work for us to do. There's a lot of need for understanding the implications of this at multiple levels. And something that's very important to our group and why we're here is that there's a real need and opportunity for collaboration across so many different areas. So I'll end there and leave it at that, where I'm excited about the opportunities and the potential to see where we wind up in a few years. And I just want to, again, a thank you for Chief Davis and the California Highway Patrol for co-hosting this event, for Jiffy for sponsoring it, for staff here at UCIPT for helping to plan this, and of course for our panelists and all of you for coming and participating. Thanks, everyone.